prepared edible wild mushrooms. And they're ordered somewhat chronologically. There are some that are out of order. But so this is a lobster salad. It's made with chicken of the woods mushroom. I also made an egg salad. There's coleslaw, and there's tomato with basil and hush puppies. So there'll be a lot of salad stuff. So I'm just gonna kind of look at the mains instead of naming everything. But the way that I make this is we'll parboil the mushroom in like an Old Bay seasoning until it's tender. Like if you pick fresh chicken of the woods and young enough, they'll be tender anyhow. And what you want to do is you want to parboil them, so not boiling hard, but just like at a slow boil with Old Bay. And then I make cocktail sauce, which is basically mayonnaise and malt vinegar and pickles of your choice. And the malt vinegar is really the secret here, and you can buy it. It's got the little English flag on it, and that's basically how I make the lobster salad. And so there's a lot of different stuff about consuming raw mushrooms, and so throughout the presentation, like I'm just going to show you things that I've done. One of the things with consuming raw mushrooms is that it's generally not recommended, and there's a bunch of different reasons for this. But if you look on salad bars across the United States, you'll see that the common button mushroom is on all the salad bars. And so obviously the FDA doesn't think it's too bad, but those mushrooms have a chemical called hydrazines, which are carcinogenic. And I just learned recently that even shiitake mushrooms have a contact dermatitis thing where a very small percentage of the population have a contact dermatitis where they get an allergic reaction to handling raw shiitake mushrooms, which I had never heard of until like literally less than a month ago. So here I had shiitake mushrooms with local goat cheese, snow peas, red radishes, and some bread from the farmer's market, and just kind of had a fresh salad, spring kind of meal. So these are oyster mushrooms, and I say wild caught because they were harvested off a tree, and this is the second batch of oyster mushrooms that I harvested off of this same tree. Pulled a lot of them, pulled close to 40 pounds, so we ate a lot of oyster mushrooms. So here are oyster mushrooms sauteed in butter with cabbage stir fry. And so the way to cook fleshy mushrooms like this, you'll see that it's got like brown crispy spots on it. The way to do that is to put the mushrooms into, I use a cast iron, I'll use these cast irons pretty much exclusively, into a warm, medium warm cast iron, and let the mushrooms sweat. So they're gonna let the liquid get out. Once you get that liquid out, you can do two things. You can either dump it and save it for stock, like don't throw it out, but just set it to the side so that you get that liquid out. You don't want them to braise, okay? Because when the mushrooms braise, they're gonna kind of be slugs and have not very good texture. So we'll get that liquid out, and then after we get like 80 to 90% of the liquid out, we're gonna reintroduce a savory fat, like butter or olive oil, okay? And so then those empty cellular spaces that the water just came out of, it literally blows up out of the cells. We're gonna put fat into that, which makes them really tasty and really juicy and allows us to get that burnt, not burnt, but caramelized crisp on the mushrooms. Thank you, come on in. So here we had a cream of oyster mushroom and potato soup with cheddar and bacon. And so it's basically just, instead of opening a can of Campbell's, I make a roux and make like a light cream sauce and just add more milk so that it's kind of thick. And then in this I'll put the mushrooms in whole so that they'll kind of boil in the mushroom soup. Obviously you're not going to boil a cream soup because your milk will curdle. You'll see that I use a lot of fatty ingredients. I like savory ingredients. You saw the salad, like I try to eat healthy, but I also like strong flavors. So here I made an omelet, and this is using those same oyster mushrooms. And so again, what I'll do here is I'll cook the mushrooms. You can see that they're already cooked before I put them into the omelet, because if you don't, they're going to be like adding raw tomatoes to your omelet or to your scrambled eggs, where it ends up just a bunch of juice and a bunch of liquid, and it's not very yummy. Another thing you can do with the oyster mushrooms, if you have a whole bunch, is dry them, and they're really good powdered. And in this case, this one looked just like a strip of bacon to me. So I took the sun-dried bacon and rendered it in bacon fat. I'm sorry, the sun-dried mushrooms and rendered them in bacon fat, which is basically just warming up that bacon fat and putting these mushrooms in them. You don't want to fry them or burn them or anything. You just want them to kind of absorb some of that mushroom fat. And that was as far as these things got. They did not make it past the paper towel to the mouth. They didn't make it onto a dish or anything. So one of the good thing about living in the mountains is that we can enjoy, fresh game. And so this is venison that my neighbor harvested, and those local oyster mushrooms. And I made a venison stroganoff. But instead of using that can of Campbell mushroom soup, I used my homemade oyster mushroom soup. And that just adds a whole new level of flavor. At this time, I was also getting paprikas. There was a local farmer at the farmer's market that was growing paprikas, and so I was roasting my own paprika, which you can see on the top right there. So not every meal is a winner, but that doesn't mean they're bad. So my kids made bread. So I made pizza, which is basically oyster mushrooms, bacon, and onions and cheese on the kids' homemade bread. Ixidia recisa is a common mushroom that grows around here on fallen deadwood. It looks like little grapes, and you can see it on the middle of the spoon right there. And it goes really good in this hot and sour soup, which is an Asian soup, basically an egg drop soup base with some vinegar and spices added to it. And I used dandelion greens along with the mushroom. So the presentation is actually online. It's on slideshare.net. If you search Cooking with Wild Mushrooms, it should be like number 5. There's some really antiquated stuff there, but then or if not, it's like slideshare.net, Jimmy Pater, Cooking with Wild Mushrooms, or something like that. So you can just view it whenever you like. So I debated whether or not to include this slide, but I did go ahead and include it because it's a good time to talk about edibility and what we could call poisonous. So there's a lot of different classes of poisonous when we talk about mushrooms. There's hallucinogenic, there's will give you gastrointestinal distress, and there's will kill you. Okay, so we don't have very many of the first in this area, and the second we have quite a few, and of the third we have a fair amount of species, but they're also really easy to identify. So one of the things that I recommend to people as far as eating and identifying mushrooms is learn which species are deadly poisonous. Because that way you can be confident that you're not picking something deadly poisonous. And it's really easy to identify them. But so with this case, with this chicken of the woods mushroom, which you can see in the middle on the right-hand side there, it's not so easy to know that something's going to make you sick. And so this mushroom didn't actually make me sick. It did make my wife sick, and she didn't eat any more of it. But for my sister and I, we both reported the same symptoms, which was we got full. So I made these chicken tenders the first night, and then the second night I made it into a curry. And would have 2 bites of my curry, and I couldn't eat any more. I was just full. And I would look at the food, and so I called my sister. I was like, what do you think about that mushroom? She says, I'm not gonna eat it anymore, basically the same story. And so this was growing on hemlock. And the way that I figured that out was because there was a huge hemlock tree across the river from where this was. This is found right by the river. And 40-foot snarl with the top broken off, and it was covered in chicken of the woods mushroom. And this was growing across the river, and it's obviously on a decayed softwood. So now I tell people not to eat chicken of the woods mushroom if it's found growing on hemlock. Okay, which kind of emphasizes the point of how difficult ID can be and knowing what to eat can be. And so we're really fortunate we live in a society where we have food safety and stuff like that. So the primary concern for yourself when you're doing this should be your health and well-being, right? Okay, so eggs are a really good match for a lot of mushrooms because they can take up the flavor really well. They have a mild flavor. You're not going to overpower the flavor. So in this dish I made poached eggs. I basically made eggs Benedict with chanterelles and green beans, but I just smothered the entire thing with hollandaise sauce. So I cook chanterelles the same way as I cook oysters. Chanterelles are one of my least favorite mushroom, and I think a lot of that has to do with what we find in this area, because I see what people find on the West Coast, and they just find these beautiful mushrooms, whereas most of the stuff that we'll find will be very small. It'll be rare that you'll find a nice big meaty chanterelle. So this is going to be a little excursion into a different kind of mushroom. So up till now, except for the chicken of the woods, which has pores, we've looked at gilled mushrooms. So oyster mushrooms have gills, chicken of the woods have pores, and so boletes also have pores. And so these are a bunch of boletes, and they are a normal looking mushroom in our conception of mushroom, but they have pores instead of gills on the bottom. So in this dish, what I did, I really, you'll see a lot of versions of this because I like steak and onions and mushrooms and blue cheese and jalapeno peppers. It's just something I like to eat, and so I cook it a lot. And so in this case, I use these bolete mushrooms. And so there's a couple different kinds of boletes here. This is what I call the good B bicolor. It used to be boletus, but now it's Beirangia bicolor. Okay, and so these down here are boletus, are more than likely Boletus sensibilis, or which is now Lammeoa sensibilis. Okay, and so this, up until very recently, was considered to be an inedible mushroom, but I've eaten it. So this is Tylopolis indecisus. And you can see that it has pink pores and it stains brown. And you can also see that there's a little bit of what's called reticulation, which is those grooves on the stem or the stipe. And so most Tylopolis will be bitter, and they'll be good in things like extracting them to make bitters for cocktails is really their best usage. Or you can just add some. Bitter is an important flavor, but it's really easy to overpower the dish with bitter. In this case, these are Tylopolis indecisus, which is the indecisive Tylopolis, and so it's not bitter, it's actually a sweet mushroom. And so here you can see the stem of the bicolor, and here you can see the stem of the sensibilis. You can see how this is red and how this is white with reticulation. And this is also another mushroom, which I'm not too sure what it was because they're supposed to be really bitter and inedible, but I ate them again in this case because they're sweet. And so I made that into this burgers with mushroom and onions. So here's a stir fry with chicken squash, chanterelles, and green beans. And so again, what I'll do is I'll cook my ingredients separately. So like I'll parboil my green beans. I'm not gonna put them into stir fry because they never cook right. Some of them end up burned on the bottom. So I'll parboil my green beans and I'll cook my chanterelles in. What I'll do is I'll start with my meat. And so once I have my meat, then I'll put my mushrooms, because my mushrooms will release liquid, which will basically deglaze my pan for me, and also make a nice broth. Okay, I'll drain that broth off to the side. I'll reserve it to add to at the end, and I'll caramelize my mushrooms. I'll set them to the side. In this case, I would add my squash to that same hot pan, and then I would combine it all together at the end. In this case, for a stir fry or something like that, I would make a cornstarch gravy. Lactarius volimus and its close relative Lactarius corugus are two of my favorite mushrooms to eat. They are fishy smelling, and that flavor will carry somewhat to the dish. So they're really easy to identify. When they grow, you'll find a lot of them. They're easy to harvest. They're easy to clean. When you harvest them, snap off the bottom of the stem, discard it, and just wipe them off and put them in your bag. I put them with the gills facing up. I personally use plastic bags from Walmart. They're easy to stuff into my pockets. I take them to the woods. If I find mushrooms, I can put 10 bags in one pocket. I could leave with 10 bags or none. And either way, I'm not encumbered. I'm not going to be in the woods long enough for them to get rotten in my plastic bags. When I get back to my truck, I'll open those bags so that they can aerate on the way home if needed. So in this case, I made Lactarius volimus, which doesn't require all of the fussy cooking like oysters and chanterelles do. But one thing that I do is I will separate the stems from the gills and fry them separately. And so you can see in the bottom left here, I've reintroduced it all. I'll cook the mushrooms and then cook the potatoes and then reintroduce it all together. And so I just made this with scrambled eggs and bacon and a salad. So these are this is when I started growing oyster mushrooms. And so this is homegrown oyster mushrooms over farm fresh fried eggs with cheddar cheese and a baked potato. It's summertime. You could see. We had tomato soup. It was like 3 or 4 different kinds of tomatoes from the garden with grilled cheese sandwiches and French filet beans, which are a really yummy kind of green bean, and the oyster mushrooms. And so I put the green beans and the oyster mushrooms together. Here, one thing that I found is that mushrooms go really well in preparations, in the typical Italian chicken preparation. So here it's marsala, but there's also piccata. There's There's like 5 or 6 different kind of chicken dishes that you can make with chicken tenderloin and kind of the classic Italian style. So here I made pork chops, marsala, which is I fry the pork chops to get a nice glaze on them, and then I'll put my oyster mushrooms into that pan. I'll deglaze the pan with a marsala wine, add a little bit of cream if you have it. If not, a little bit of milk is fine to kind of cream it up, not too much, just a tablespoon. And then I also made a cheese bread with this. So here you can see this is lion's mane, Hericium. This is cultivated, but you can see what I did here. Hericium, lion's mane, all of the 3 or 4 different edible species make really good crab cakes because of their texture and their consistency. And that's one of the cool things about mushrooms, is that the people will say, oh, I don't like mushrooms because I don't like the texture. I'm like, well, you never had me cook them for it. You know, it's just, there's a lot of different ways to make things. And here you can see that these things are basically like, they were so crispy that they're like little nuggets almost, and just have a nice real crisp skin, and there was no preparation. I didn't even make these into crab cakes. You can do that if you have, but these were so fresh.
So how did you get it crispy like that? What
fry them in butter. Just don't turn them like you would fry a steak. Okay, instead of messing with it all the time, just leave them. Keep it on like a 4 to a 6, depending on your range. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And just leave them until they caramelize. Because these things aren't going to have very much liquid in them.
Okay.
So this is another one of the classic Italian chicken tenderloin preparations, and this is probably my favorite edible mushroom. It's Hymioporus spatula, and it's called the shaggy stalk bolete. You can't really see it, but here you can see that I separate the stems and the caps. And so you can see the glaze that I've already gotten in my pan from frying the chickens. And so then I'll take my mushrooms here, I'll take these caps, and this is the same case where I'll just leave them. You don't want to turn them too much. You just want to flip them once, if possible. So you just leave them, let them, these things are kind of slug-like, but the flavor is really good. The stems, on the other hand, are really perfect. They're crisp and got a great texture like a cucumber, but the flavor is like a lemon. So they're really citrusy. So chicken piccata, the way that it's normally made is you would fry your chickens and then deglaze with a white wine, and then make a light cream sauce, again, 2 tablespoons of cream or something like that, and then add capers and lemon or lime. In this case, I don't use any citrus except for the mushroom, and the flavor still comes through, and it tastes, and it's like there's no citrus at all in it except for this mushroom, which is really cool. So here I made steak and mushrooms and onions. You can see in the top right the prep station and prepping everything out. That's how I cook my steaks, the same way that I cook my onions, which is the lion's mane, which is to let them sear really well on one side. Don't flip them back and forth. So this is a little bit different, and this thing doesn't really show it so well. But this is chicken with ras al hanout, which is a Moroccan spice, which basically means blend of the house, or house blend. And it's kind of like a warm cinnamon, coriander, chili blend, and it can come in a lot of different versions. And so I made mustard greens, fried green tomatoes, and also fried mushrooms. And you can see that I use 2 different kinds of batter here. So for the fried green tomatoes, I made like a cornmeal batter. So this is triple dipped, okay? This is flour, egg, and then in the final case, I probably used a blend of cornmeal and panko, which is kind of like what I like, because it gives you a nice crisp crust, but it also gives you that cornmeal texture. But for these oyster mushrooms, you can see that I made a real thin tempura batter, which is basically just flour and water. I like to add a little bit of baking powder because it gives it a little bit of lift, and a little bit of salt, just to flavor it up a little. And so this batter, when you dip it in, and it should drip off, and that'll give you a real thin, so that you can still see. And so again, what I'm trying to do is I'm not just trying to exploit the flavors. I'm trying to also work with the textures, and to make different textures, all from basically the same thing. And so you can see them frying in the top right.
When you're talking about oyster mushrooms, are you talking about blues or goldens, or?
So if you would get blue or gold oyster mushrooms around here, they would be cultivated. So you can do basically any of this with any oyster mushroom. Any of the things that I've done with gilled mushrooms, like oysters or chanterelles, are basically interchangeable. And so like even making steak and onions, you can make that with oyster mushrooms, you can make that with any gilled mushroom. The only thing is like with the lactarius that I find, it doesn't take as much prep. And the texture of those fishy lactarius is so much more robust versus an oyster or a chanterelle that when it has tooth. So this is pork chops with local beans and taters, oyster mushroom and home roasted paprika gravy. So I learned a long time ago, but in Asian cultures they'll use mushrooms as thickeners. So I had all these oyster mushrooms because I started growing oyster mushrooms. So I had already dried a whole bunch, And so I made some powder, and this gravy was thickened entirely with oyster mushroom. It's not as thick as a normal gravy, but it was still thickened. And so these are actually pan roasted paprikas. I would roast them in the oven. Those paprikas were great. So mole is a Mexican dish which can come in multiple different varieties. The most common mole when we talk about moles is a black or brown mole, which is made with chocolate. So I made mole flavored pad thai the other night, and I wanted an actual chicken mole. And so the way this is, on the top right here, we have suilus mushrooms, which are also called slippery jacks. They grow in association with pines and conifers. They're not very good by themselves. I will not eat them fresh like this. If they're like this, where the pores are still white and small and closed together and they have a firm enough texture, I'd put them in something like mushrooms and onions. Otherwise, what I do with them is dry them. And then on the bottom right is the biggest bee bicolor that I ever found. So this is the prep for the chicken mole, and mole basically involves a bunch of steps. It's not very difficult, it's just a bunch of standing in the kitchen. You start by toasting nuts. In this case I did cashews, and these are all the different spices that I use. And one of the things about making the mole is that you toast your spices and you toast your nuts and you layer the flavors, okay? So you toast your nuts and you grind them. And you toast your spices dry, and then you also toast, I personally toast half and half, so that you'll dry roast some and you'll roast some in oil. So you're going to be extracting the flavors and manipulating the flavors in multiple different ways. And so I also use these peppers, and these are oven roasted, which I grinded up at the time to give it a little bit of paste to it. And these are the dried bee bicolors. These are fresh paprikas, and these are the dried paprikas. And then this is the chicken, and you can't see the mole because I separated the skin and stuffed it underneath the skin. And so it was really yummy, and it incorporated mushrooms, even there were no actual whole mushrooms. So this is basically a riff on chicken marsala, but instead of using marsala wine, I use sherry wine. So I just will cook my chickens, I'll deglaze, I'll combine it all together, I'll make a roux, and make a quick sauce. And so on the bottom right, you can see the oyster mushrooms, and I also used dried suilus mushroom mix. I actually use that stuff in just about every dish that I make, like chilies or stir fries or anything that's savory, because it adds a little bit of undertone to the flavor. It adds that extra depth of flavor to every dish I've tried it in. So I make weird stuff, basically where I'll just combine stuff together. So I made some chili, and it's in quotes because it's basically just ground beef and beans is the only resemblance to chili that it has. But I used Matuk's Kuchela, which is an Indian condiment. You can buy it online. It's a green mango chutney. It's really awesome. And then my wife or I had bought some lime curd, and also some sour currant jam, and they were just kind of sitting in the fridge. So I combined all of those and with some fenugreek and garlic powder and made this chili, which you can see down here. And I roasted some butternut squash, and then I made turnip greens. And whenever I make greens, I will always add some kind of sweetener to them at the end. I try not to boil my greens to death, and I try also not to put too much water so that I can retain the green stuff and not dump it out with my water. And so I'll add something like molasses or brown sugar. And so in this case, I had made candied Hymioporus betula, which is the citrusy mushroom that I talked about. And the candied mushrooms didn't turn out so good, but the syrup was really yummy because it was like this lemony, mushroomy syrup. And so I flavored the greens in this case. So there's no actual whole mushrooms in this dish, but there's mushroom flavor in everything except the squash. So this is Stropharia rugosa annulata, also called SRA for short, or wine caps. And it's a big, beefy, meaty mushroom. Really good, better than a portobello by far. It doesn't turn black, you can see. And so I made chuck eye steaks with sweetless powder, and then this is with also the SRA mushrooms with a fresh salad. So this is pork marsala with reishi mushrooms, which was in the first slide. And I finished mine with blue cheese and jalapeno vinaigrette on the salad. So this is Ganoderma suge, which is our local North Carolina commonly encountered version of what would be called reishi mushroom. Reishi is a mushroom that grows in Asia. It's similar looking to these, but it's actually not very closely related to these. No research has ever really been done conclusively with these, but they're often used medicinally by people who make teas or tincture or double extract, which is where you would be to combine a tea and a tincture. But I like to eat them. And so these tips here, these white tips, are all edible. You'll cut around. There'll be a pretty clear dividing line where the yellow stops. And you don't want the yellow because it will be very bitter. What you're after is those white tips, like's on the right. And so in the dish, the previous dish, like I said, I made pork marsala and just used these reishi mushroom tips. And this is the finished dish. You can see on the bottom left, I will cook my meat and then I'll put my mushrooms in the same pan. The reishi tips don't need special prep like draining the liquid. They're very firm, and they'll basically, you'll have to add fat to them in order for them not to stick and scald. And so this time I took those same Ganoderma suge tips and combined them with fresh local leeks. One of the things that I do with ground beef, I have 4 children, so the boys are still under the age of 3, and the girls are almost 17 and 12. But we still go through a lot of food, and so to make things simpler, over the years I have started taking the entire ground beef, and I'll put 3 ground beef in this large cast iron, and I will let them sear really well on one side, and then I'll flip them over and let them sear really well on the other, and then I'll take my metal spatula and I'll cut them into 4, I'll make 3 cuts basically, so I get a 1/4 pound logs, which also makes them really easy to portion when you're serving people. So you're like, oh, my sister got more or whatever kind of thing. And so that's what I did in that case. So here I made some shrimp scampi along with a red cabbage stir fry. And lion's mane is a mushroom that I never really put it in a dish. I just always eat it by itself. I don't know why. I guess I just like it fried in butter, but I kind of realized that after making this presentation. So this is one of the best dishes that I ever made, and it didn't come out looking very good. One of the things is my lighting, but it just came out looking kind of brown. But it's pork belly with reishi tips in a dried fruit, balsamic, and pancetta spice glaze. And so my neighbors started harvesting pigs, basically, and so I got some pork belly, and my one neighbor taught me how to cure meat, so I started curing pork bellies and making bacon and pancetta, and so I made a traditionally Italian spice pancetta, which I included in here, and I took my pork belly and I cubed it along with my cubed reishi mushrooms, and I cooked it all together. The flavors of this dish were really good, but the textures were also really good, where the mushroom and the pork belly were so similar that I have to stop and look like, what am I eating now? Is this mushroom or is this animal? So that was really cool. And I sided this with yellow squash with herbes de Provence, which is a French herb blend which has tarragon and thyme and marjoram and some other stuff, and also some oven roasted red and golden beets. Like I said, mushrooms and onions. But in this case, I took Maripilus substemi, which is the black staining polypore, which also grows around here. It's easy to find. You'll find it in profusion, and you can make burgers with it. It makes a really good burger. If I did this again, I would get actual beef tallow. In this case, I used bacon fat, and the bacon fat was just too strong of a bacon flavor. Like, I would actually get some tallow to combine it. And so what you do is you will parboil your mushroom. I would probably just lightly salt and not flavor the boiling water too much, and then you're going to take it out and you're going to put it in a food processor. And like I said, I mixed it with bacon fat, but I would get some beef tallow. And so I made a 4-cheese sauce. I made burgers out of mushrooms and then sided it with mushrooms and onions, which is in this case another mixed boletes mushroom. So this is farm eggs with forest mushroom medley. It's basically chanterelles, hedgehogs, and oysters. And what I do for all of these, basically, these dishes, the majority of these, like, I don't know, 80%, I just walk out of my back door, and I live on the kind of like the top of a ridge, and there's an old logging road that connects my house to my neighbor's house, and I just walk down that logging road, and that's where I find most of these mushrooms. So I'm fortunate in that regard that I can just walk out my back door and find some dinner. And so you'll see I start using that homemade pancetta, which is on the top right. And so basically I made scrambled eggs. And then I made this really cool beet salad with dill and caraway and sour cream, kind of like a play on borscht or like a pickled Eastern European salad. So there's a mushroom that has the same flavor as maple syrup. And so maple syrup and fenugreek, which is a spice, and candy cap mushroom, which is Lactarius rubidius, which is not found here but is found on the West Coast, all have the same active chemical, which is called sodalon, and you can make maple syrup flavored stuff. In this case, I made maple syrup flavored home cured bacon, and I made pancakes and fruit salad. And then you can see the sprinkle, which is the candy cap sugar, which is powdered candy cap combined with sugar. So on the bottom left, you'll see the candy cap. And then on the top left is where it's been grinded, and I actually mixed a little bit of brown sugar into it. I didn't want to put too much because it'll burn and stick to the pan. In the center there, you can see they're being fried. So this vichyssoise is a French dish, which is basically a potato and leek cream soup. So this is either vichyssoise with rabbit stock and armillaria mushroom, which is honey mushrooms, or it's cream of honey mushroom soup in rabbit stock with potatoes and leeks, because I'm pretty sure that the French would not approve of my rabbit stock or my mushrooms, but they might, I don't know, I don't ever know. So the first night I made this with Exidia recisa, and it's also using fresh leeks and fresh potatoes. It's one of my favorite dishes to make because those two things, they come in at the same time, and you can get new potatoes and fresh leeks. And so the first day with Exidia recisa, which is on the left, was good, but the second day when I added fresh or home cured pancetta and cube cheddar was much better. So I got truffles, which are not something that you'll find as a wild mushroom around here, but I decided to include them because I made some really yummy dishes with truffles. So I got 3 different kinds of truffles. I got Italian Perigord truffles, I got Oregon white truffles, and I also got Oregon black truffles. So the Perigord truffles and the Oregon white truffles kind of have a similar flavor where they'll taste really garlicky and very strong, whereas the Oregon black truffles have a more mild flavor and actually taste kind of like pineapple or fruit punch. So I made a rib roast marinated in truffle butter with truffle gravy and mustard greens and turnips on the side. You can see I just kind of let the truffles be the star here. A good way to preserve mushrooms like chanterelles or black trumpets or truffles is to make a truffle butter, or is to make butter with them. You can make duxelles, which is a French preparation where you'll have about equal ratios of butter and mushrooms, but I like to make an actual butter, which will there'll be like 4-to-1 butter to mushrooms. And so what I'll do is I'll warm up my butter, and so you don't want it to separate, so you have to do it over low heat. If you cook the butter too fast, you'll see that the white stuff will start to collect on the top. That means you're rendering the milk fat solids. So you can even buy ghee, which is clarified butter, and you can buy it in both of those forms, and then you wouldn't have to worry about that. And but I just do it like that. If you warm it up over low heat, and then you add your truffles or your black trumpets, or another one of my favorite things with black trumpet butter is to put it on fresh corn on the cob. It's super yummy like that. But here what I did is I made a truffle butter, and so you warm up your butter and you put your truffles in and you let it sit, and then for a day, at least a day. And then I took my rib roast, which was a whole rib roast, and I slathered it in like a stick of butter and let it sit in the fridge again another day, and then roast it after that. So I made a truffle baked brie, which is what we're trying to do is I'm trying to impart these flavors. Say what?
That looks so good.
It was so good. It was gone like this. It was for the night before Christmas, and like I it's like you may have one piece. You may have one piece. You may have one piece.
I may have
so
five pieces.
I sliced the brie in half, and I put the truffles. And this was actually the Oregon Blacks, which are those more pineapple-y, fruit punchy flavored. And so I covered it back and I wrapped it in the paper and I put it in the cardboard thing and I put it back in the fridge for a day. And then I wrapped it in phyllo, and basically I wrapped it in phyllo and put it back in the fridge for another, so it was truffled for basically 2 nights. I went to Puerto Rico like 3 years ago now, and I got some honey there that tastes like fruit punch. And so I was growing some mint, and I made some mint salt. And so this is a baked brie finished with mint salt and Puerto Rican honey.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
where did you get the truffles?
I ordered them from somebody.
Yeah.
I mean online, a Facebook guy actually. So this is I wanted a cheesecake, and I asked I'm part of the Cooking with Wild Mushrooms group on Facebook. I highly recommend it. It's the best group on Facebook. I love it. And I asked, like, has anybody ever made a savory cheesecake? Because that's what I really wanted. And so that's what this is. It's not a New York style, but there is a little bit of sour cream in it. And so I flavored the cream cheese with the truffles again and let it sit overnight. And then I made this truffle cheesecake, and it actually uses Munster cheese also. I put cubed Munster cheese, and like, it came out just right because the cream cheese and the sour cream, it all set up, but the Munster still retained some of its goo, and it was just awesome. And so I had to finish it with that same Puerto Rican honey and mint salt because it just was perfect. The previous time on the baked brie, I had to do it again. So I had to keep it simple this time. So this is just hamburger steaks with a truffle gravy. And roasted potatoes. So this is carbonara. This is another traditional Italian preparation. And carbonara, basically the way that a carbonara is prepared is you'll boil your pasta and you'll reserve some of your pasta water. You'll drain your pasta. And again, I cook for an army. So in this case, what I do is I'll use 4 egg yolks and 4 whole eggs. So that's for about not a whole pound, but I'll cook the whole pound of pasta, and I'll do about 3/4 of the pound. I'll reserve some of it to the side. And you want to add your eggs to your hot noodles. You don't want them to be so hot that your eggs get scrambled. You can see that it's just creamy. You can see right there that it's just creamy, and you just want to slowly warm up that egg mixture and then add pasta water to thin it as needed. And so in this case, I made carbonara with truffles and my homemade Italian pancetta with sauteed sugar snap peas. So my daughter made tiramisu, and she wouldn't let me put truffles in it. So I put them on my own plate, and it was really yummy. Those are the Oregon black truffles. And so on the top of the frame, on the top left, is the Oregon black. On the right is the Oregon white, and on the bottom is the Perigord truffle. When the truffle is right, it gets these things, and this is called gleba, this little mass of stuff, and that's the actual spore mass. And so this is just keeping it simple with some crackers because I wanted to sample the flavors. So this is Lactarius bulimus, and it has the correct genus there, which is actually Lactifluus bulimus. And so it's the voluminous Lactarius, and it's voluminous because it exudes so much milk. And Lactarius will bleed when you find them. And so in this case, this Lactarius, the milk stains brown. So you can see every place that it's been damaged, and it will stain your fingers. These ones here are still fine to eat. And you can see why I like them. Like I said, they're clean, they're big, they're easy to find, they're easy to prepare. And so here I made steak and onions and mushrooms. And so on the bottom left, I'll separate my caps from my stems because I'll cook them separately. I'll cook my stems first and add my caps to them so that they'll cook at the same rate. You'll end up with about the same texture because the caps are a lot less substantial, whereas the stems are more meaty and dense. And so this is after I've added them all together. And then again, I'll do the onions and whatever separately. It looks like I've mixed it all together at that point. And then some fresh new potatoes and some rare steak, because that's how I like it. So there's a lot of other stuff besides using mushrooms in traditional preparations that we can do. So this is spiraceus, which is also, the one I'll use here is actually Spiraceus spathulata, which is also commonly called the cauliflower mushroom. And this is using a freshly made tomato sauce with homegrown tomatoes and fresh basil and chicken. And I topped it with Lactarius indigo and mixed chanterelles. For the coleslaw, I made a green goddess dressing, and it's in quotes because it's not exactly green goddess. Green goddess is typically made using avocado and mayonnaise or something similar to that, whereas this dressing used pink speckle beans, fresh mustard greens for spice, and purslane, which is an herb that grows everywhere, real easy to grow, makes so much seeds. My goodness, why did I plant this stuff? That easy to grow. And it's kind of slimy. It kind of tastes like cactus if you've ever eaten like Mexicans make nopales. And fresh nopales are good, but those canned things, ugh, I don't like those canned pickle ones personally. But purslane was great in this because it added some sliminess, which was good for the dressing because it didn't have any mayonnaise. So this is an entirely, totally vegan. I guess I did make a vegan dish. Huh? Wow, I didn't even realize it. Well, oh, except the chicken, I bet. So on the left is mixed chanterelles. And this is Lactarius indigo, which is the blue Lactarius. And its main appeal, in my opinion, is that it's cool. It's not very flavorful. It's cool. Fun to make. And so this is Phaeolus schweinitzi, which is a dyer's polypore, which you can use you can see some of the bronze orange color that the people that use mushrooms to dye fabric with are going for. This is Lactarius volimus in two different kinds of I don't think stages is the right word. It's one of those things, like sometimes it seems like they just appear, but they're just different forms would be a better word, because this is not going to turn into this. Look, this is already much taller and this is so much broader, but it's still the same mushroom. And that's one of the things that's confusing about mushroom identification is how can this be the same? Well, because it's the same mushroom. How can people have such vast differences? How can dogs be bred into same thing? Same thing. So this is the spiraceus, and it's Spiraceus spathulata, like spatula, okay, and because it has wider fronds. And so there's two different kinds of chanterelles here. This is, I'm not going to even venture, but anyhow, this is Gyroporus castaneus, which is the chestnut bolete, which I wish that I could find more of because they have a really good nutty flavor. So they're even the kind of thing where, like, when I'll cook this, they won't even make it into the mix because I'll eat them.
How does the Lactarius indigo get its color?
I do not know, but blue dye has been sought after for thousands of years. But nobody ever used Lactarius indigo mushrooms. Except for one guy we're going to see, he actually made ice cream. And I've got a picture at the very end.
That's cool.
So, on the left is the green goddess dressing, which again is just beans, pink speckled peas, purslane, and spicy mustard greens. In the middle, I parboiled my Spiraceus mushroom after coarsely chopping it to the texture of egg noodles. And on the right is the freshly made tomato sauce. When I make tomato sauce, I love tomatoes. So tomato season, I get tomatoes for free from people that I know. I hear boxes and boxes of tomatoes, and so they all go into the pot and we stew them. And then I like to strain them because I don't like all the seeds and stuff. And so basically I'll just, when I do tomatoes stock or soup or whatever you want to call it, I'll just squeeze the whole tomato and put the whole thing in there. So we'll get all the good chemicals from the skins and from the seeds and all that kind of stuff, the little meal around it. But then when we go to eat it, I strain it first. And so that ends up with this very thin stock preparation, whatever, that can be used for a lot of things. And so in this case, this is entirely reduced. I didn't thicken it at all, and it came out great. And so then this was the plated dish, which is the noodles are actually mushrooms. So these are some lesser used or lesser known mushrooms. Chanterelle mushrooms come in a variety of different species, and there's about three. One, this isn't the peach chanterelle. This is Cantharellus velutinus in the pink form. Supposedly it comes in multiple different forms, but this is what I call our local version of Cantharellus siberius, which is the meaty chanterelle. One of the things about mushroom identification and naming mushrooms is that none of the names are right. And so as we go, it's all changing. But and the reason for that is because our identification of mushrooms is based on European perception of mushrooms that were growing in North America. And so basically they were all called the same thing, even though they look similar, they're vastly different. A pine tree that grows in Europe is not necessarily the same pine tree that grows in North America. And so that's the case that we have when we're trying to name these. And so here you can see another form of chanterelle, which is probably Cantharellus latericius, which is the smooth chanterelle. And so those are all chanterelles. And this is Galliella rufa, which grows abundantly and really grew abundantly this year especially, so much that I decided to try to start eating it. And so I made a chanterelle pasta, sorry about that, pasta with carrots and mixed chanterelles. And then for the salad, I made, I like to make a seaweed salad style vinaigrette. And so for that, what I'll do is I'll use a neutral oil, like a canola oil, along with rice vinegar, wasabi powder, sesame oil, and a little bit of soy sauce and garlic powder to kind of make it taste like seaweed salad from the sushi place. And so in this case, what I did was I marinated my mushrooms, this Galliella rufa, which is on the left. I diced them, so like those bigger ones that you see, this one would get cut into 4, and these ones were left whole like that. So those went into the marinade while I was preparing the pasta. And then at the end, only at the very end, did I add the tomatoes and the cucumbers, because that way the cucumbers don't end up cooking in your vinegar and they end up like starting to change color. But these were still fresh and crispy. And so it's kind of like a seaweed salad style. And I make that a lot. So here I made steak and mushroom and onions. And I took the leftover steak and mushroom and onions, and I made it into an omelet. This is, you can see, with the same green goddess coleslaw. Like I said, I cook and we'll eat leftovers regularly, just to kind of reincorporate stuff so that I don't have to cook quite so much. And so this omelet is one of the few, like, they don't always come out this perfect, but this one just came out really nicely. I actually was able to flip the whole thing, like you can see. And that's local goat cheese, which is another thing that I really like. So, on the Cooking with Wild Mushrooms group, they had a Chopped challenge, and Chopped is a TV show where they give chefs different ingredients and they have to use it. So the basket ingredients in this case were Spam, peanut butter. You were supposed to use Swiss chard, but we couldn't get any, so we used Napa cabbage and puff pastry, along with a wild mushroom of your choice. So I make a dish regularly, which I call egg pie, which is basically just like whatever leftover greens and stuff like that I have, and I add 8 to a dozen eggs and bake it in a cast iron in the oven. I don't add anything to it, any crust or anything like that. Sometimes I'll take leftover bread and I'll put butter and toast the breadcrumbs and then dump the egg over it. And so I wanted to kind of riff on that with this dish, and they had a couple of these, and I thought about this a long time. And so I made this really awesome Ethiopian fusion style dish. So on the left there you can see the basket quote ingredients, which is the Spam. This is mixed sweetless powder. This is sweetless, dried sweetless, and also dried candy caps. These are locally grown Napa cabbage and some puff pastry. Here I made the sauce, starting the sauce, which is peanut butter and soy sauce and rice vinegar. And I also added powdered candy caps with sugar. And then I also made a tea, or basically I did another extraction of the mushrooms to get this liquid here, which is basically candy cap flavored liquid. So that was my sauce. This is my now. He was 2 at the time, but he's 3 now. So in the center there, you can see that one of the things that I do is I will fry the spices or toast the spices in oil, and that's actually an Indian technique, and it really helps to add the flavor. These are Ethiopian spices. You can see ethiopianspices.com. And the abish is, I think it's actually fenugreek. I really don't know. The mitmita is a spicy chili blend, and the kibikimin is another one of these warm blends, but it's very spicy. So I took my Spam and my sweetless powder, and I really dumped the sweetless powder on top of it. You can see on the left, I really added it to it, and I added some of this kibikimin along with some peanut butter there, and I mixed that all up really well, and then I rendered that until it was nice and crispy and brown and made a little crumble. So here I made another preparation, which is the preparation for the eggs. So again, we're starting with the Ethiopian spices and the wild mushroom powders and rendering them in a fat, and then adding the egg mixture. I buttered and dusted my pan with net shiro, which is flour that Ethiopians use to make their traditional bread, and then layered the puff pastry in. The Napa cabbage was prepared separately, added to the puff pastry, added the eggs, added some fresh chopped peanuts, baked the whole thing. Halfway through or so, you add your Spam crumbles on the top, and then you finish it all with more Spam crumbles and toasted peanuts and the peanut butter sauce from the first thing. My wife said that it was just what she wanted for dinner that night. True story. And it was really yummy. It's definitely one of the best dishes that I've ever made. Top 3. My top 3 dishes are all on here. So not everything is a success. I tried to make candied galli alla rufa. So this is using fresh peaches. So I made peach syrup and go through all this stuff and candy the things and let them sit in the crock pot overnight. And they were gross, and I put them in some soup. So oven roasting is something that I've been exploring recently. And so this is sweetless mushrooms, and they're oven roasted. And they were really good this way. And so this is freshly butchered pig. I made a standing rib roast out of it. It didn't work out as well as a beef standing rib roast because you have to carve it away from the bone. You can't separate each individual rib. And then I took this roasted sweetless mushroom and roasted potatoes, and that looks like it's mushroom gravy on the side with some these pink speckled peas. I get occasionally are pretty good. So this is jammy poached eggs, and I like to, I'll make eggs, soft-boiled eggs in varying different cookednesses so that you can get different flavors of them. And so this is with just basic, soft-boiled eggs with mushrooms over grits. This is me preparing mushroom charcuterie, basically. And so this is the cuts. These have been cured already with curing salt. I do use nitrite, so whatever. And on the left, we have the mixed sweetless powder. We have dried Hymioporus betula, which is the lemony bolete. This is Ganoderma suge, which is the reishi mushroom. And then these are mixed sweetless mushrooms. And I'll harvest 3 to 5 or so different species of sweetless mushrooms, and I basically just put them all on the dehydrator and let them sit for the season. I just leave the stuff on the dehydrator. Once I start something to dehydrate, I pretty much leave it until it's done. You'll see, I guess you don't see it right here, but I'll use silica packets. Like this jar here and here, I'll put silica packets, which are those little things that you get and they'll keep it dry. You can reuse those by putting them in the microwave. You put them in the microwave and you get them hot and you flip them over and you cook them basically, and you'll get all that water out of them and they'll be able to reabsorb water. So I made 5 different kinds, and I've actually been eating these recently. They're really yummy. So I made one which is Italian seasoning with lots of fennel seed and mixed sweetless powder. I made a curry powder, ginger, hing, and Ganoderma suge mushroom. And hing is an Indian spice. It's asafoetida, and it's another one of these things that tastes like foot. It's best description that I have for it. You want to use it in small quantities, like 1/8 of a teaspoon quantities, and it's another one of these things that you'll want to put it in your oil and use that as a finishing oil. It will bring all that aroma and all that flavor. I made another pancetta which was just sueless, the mixed sueless, and then one that was just, it used to be A betula, but now it's H betula, and then one with paprika, kind of chorizo style. And so you can see all the spices there in the middle, and on the right you can see 4 different kinds of mushroom preparations. Starting right here is the mixed sueless. This is curry powder and Ganoderma mushroom, and I don't really know what those two are, what the differences would be. It looks like this one is the betula, the shaggy stalk, the citrusy one. And so there they are, and that's how they look sliced. And this is, I had made mashed potatoes and mashed turnips all together, so I took the leftover mashed potatoes and turnips and added some flour and baking powder and make fritters, and that's a bok choy salad with Exidia ricisa mushrooms and eggs and pancetta. This is Lactarius carugus, which is, like I said, that close cousin of Lactarius volemus, which is this one right here. And the differences will be that these are a lot more red and the stalks will be a lot more red. They'll both smell the same. They both have the same texture. They're basically the same mushroom for our cooking purposes. You can also see I've got some Galiella rufas. I've got 3 different kinds of chanterelles, some Gyroporus castaneus, and a sueless. And so in this case, I just cooked the sueless because I just made it all together with some fresh local green beans and garlic chives, which are the tops of garlic plants. And so I do have some acknowledgments. And this is John Doty, and he's on the Cooking with Wild Mushroom groups. He actually lives here in North Carolina, and he made this Lactarius ice cream. And this is one of the dishes that really inspired me to get into cooking more with wild mushrooms, because I cook already and they're always like, oh, you cook good. And I saw this, I was like, wow, mushrooms are cool. And so this is Spike, and Spike lives in the Northeast in Rhode Island or something, and he's a professional chef and has a really nice place to take pictures. But this is foie gras finished with tapenella, and these are not beginner mushrooms. With tapenella, which is the mushroom that he's holding, and an absinthe caramel sauce, and complemented with candied fennel and shallots. And this is mole frite, finished with a sherry morel cream sauce and buttered lobster. And I really like this dish because anytime anything is finished with lobster, it's gotta be really, really good. And so I am having a Smoky Mountain Mushroom Festival, which is gonna be October 4th, 5th, and 6th. The main foray is gonna be the 5th. And we're gonna have camping. On Saturday, we're going to have 4 different lecturers talking about everything from microremediation to ethnobotany, identification, and then on Sunday, we're going to extract DNA and sequence it and put it on the Tree of Life. And so you can go to that website and register. I got you. So one for you, young lady, and one for you, and one for you, and one for you too. Thank you. And I wanted to share this. I walked by. I actually used this at a recent foray. Can you see it? Can everybody see it? Creamy pasta. This is Bon Appetit magazine, and I get Bon Appetit magazine, and not every issue, but almost every issue. I tell my daughter, I'm like, look, they're copying me again. I swear they stalk me, they Facebook stalk me and steal my recipes. But I had literally, like the same time, I had made crispy pasta with creamy mushroom sauce or whatever, creamy pasta with crispy mushrooms, and there it is right there, the dish that they made. But I didn't add it to here because it happened too quickly and all. But I made a cream sauce, and I added Italian sausage and chicken of the woods mushroom to it, and basically made this dish. And then I get this magazine 2 days later in the mail, which is always interesting. But thank you everybody for coming. And you want questions or anything?
Your chicken of the woods, do you always parboil it?
No.
Okay, because I've never parboiled it. I've cooked it a lot.
I parboiled it for that salad because that was the only cooking that I did for it. But somebody gave me these, and they are,
right,
perfectly fresh, beautiful, prime. I'm not gonna parboil them by any means.
Okay, yeah. I was wondering, I've read people saying that you need to first, but I never have.
I never do either.
And the black truffle butter you were talking about, could I do that with dried black truffles? Because I have
Black
a ton
trumpets?
of, trumpets,
For
sorry.
sure.
I've dried a
sure.
bunch this summer. But
For sure.
Okay.
You make us hungry.
Yeah,
Really?
I know. Where's there to eat around here?
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for
That was
coming.
great.
So much, you must be good.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure.
Cleaning your mushrooms.
Uh-huh.
I know they say don't put water on them unless
You can stop that now.
cook them immediately. Some people say I always wash mine.